G'day everybody, I've got Magnus Vinding here today, and we're going to be talking about effective altruism and how, well, his specific book, which is called Effective Altruism, How Can We Best Help Others? And yeah, Magnus Vinding has been quite a prolific writer. He's the author of Why We Should Go Vegan, Why Happy Meat is Always Wrong, Speciesism, Why It Is Wrong and the Implications of Rejecting It, Reflections on Intelligence, You Are Them, and his book, which we're going to be discussing today, which I just mentioned. So welcome back, Magnus. How are you doing?
Thanks a lot, Adam, and thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here.
My pleasure. So let's get right into it then. Before actually talking about the book here, we want to sort of help situate the discussion by defining a few terms. So there's a few terms which you've suggested that we define first, and one of them is suffering-focused ethics. Do you want to give a brief description of what that means?
Sure, although perhaps we should take a step back first and define the term effective altruism. Sure. I think it's important to distinguish between two different senses of the term effective altruism. So effective altruism as an ideal has been defined by philosopher William McGaskill as the project of using evidence and reason to figure out how to benefit others as much as possible and taking action on that basis. And that's actually the ideal that my book seeks to examine. But there's also effective altruism as a social movement consisting of people who are trying to live up to this ideal. And I think it's important to distinguish between these two senses of the term, because my book is an examination of this ideal. It does not by any means speak for the entire effective altruism community, and I think that's an important point for me to make, and also something that's relevant for this next term, which what you just mentioned, namely suffering-focused ethics, which is the particular set of values that I and some other people in the effective altruism community would favor. But the thing is that there are many different strands of the effective altruism community, and they have both different values and also tend to focus on different causes. And that's actually one of the main things that my book seeks to examine, is this question of fundamental values, which I think is actually something that's often quite unexamined among effective altruists. What are the values that we are, or rather I should say, what does helping others really mean? I mean, we all have this common sense understanding of what helping or benefiting others means, but when we dig a bit deeper into it and try to get more precise about it, it's actually, our views tend to diverge quite a lot. And there isn't really universal agreement about what helping others means. For instance, when it comes to population ethics, there are many different positions about what is optimal, and they are often not really well in alignment, you can say. And
yes, population ethics is one of my favorite points of ethics discussion, the philosophical discussion there. Yeah, I hope to be able to do more interviews on that particular subject in the future.
Right, it's very interesting, and it's also extremely relevant for effective altruists, especially when we focus on when it comes to impacting the far future or the long-term future. But yeah, so my book actually starts out introducing effective altruism in quite general terms, introducing some of the concepts that are, I guess you could say, some of the core virtues within effective altruism, such as being impartial in terms of the beings we're trying to help. It shouldn't matter what gender or what sexuality or what species even the beings that we're trying to help belong to. The same suffering is equally worth preventing, no matter who is experiencing it. The equal interest should count equally, is basically what impartiality is all about. And then there's also the importance of being aware of our biases. We have various biases that prevent us from thinking clearly, you could say, and that's one of the other core virtues of effective altruism, to really be aware of these biases. One especially relevant bias when it comes to effective altruism is this of scope neglect or scope insensitivity, our inability to really feel the number of beings who are affected by a disaster, to really appreciate the importance of numbers. We tend to view our emotions seem to really stop at one, in fact. So if a tragedy happens to one person, it seems just about as bad as if it happens to a lot of people. And so that's an important thing for us to be aware of, that we don't intuitively appreciate the difference. And so therefore we have to really be careful when we evaluate what we focus on, and try to focus more on the numbers than we intuitively would. But
indeed,
after having presented some of those considerations, also about how it's important how what kind of career we choose is very relevant as effective altruists. It's something we can have a great impact in, since it's so much of our time is going to be spent in our professional career, and therefore it makes a lot of sense to focus on that, which is also what the effective altruist organization 80,000 Hours is focusing on. And another thing I briefly cover is this is monetary donations, which is also something that a lot of effective altruists have focused a lot on. One prominent path, you could say, is something that's been mentioned a lot, is this path of doing earning to give, where you take up you try to pursue a high earning career, and then you try to donate a lot of money to effective charities. But those kinds of basic topics, I guess you could say, in effective altruism is really not my main concern in my book. My main concern is actually more, you could say, deeper reflective issues, namely about fundamental values. And that's where I try to really, I think I'm trying to start a conversation about what kind of values is it that we should have as effective altruists, and even just perhaps also.
Well, is this important? Because in order to help determine how to do the most good, or how to do, we should really focus on the question of what is good, what fundamentally is good, and how can we distribute value over large amounts of people, for instance. So now you've focused on suffering-focused ethics. Do you want to just describe why you think that we should focus on reducing suffering more than we should focus on, I guess, well-being or increasing happiness?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I should perhaps mention that suffering-focused ethics is this umbrella term that covers all views that give particular importance on reducing suffering. And these views can be defended with appeal to quite different intuitions. So for instance, there's the intuition that failing to prevent suffering is something that's bad and problematic, while failing to create happiness is not. And this is also a view that's reflected in, now we mentioned population ethics earlier, but a quite popular view called the asymmetry, according to which we have an obligation to avoid bringing miserable lives to the world, but we don't have an obligation to bring happy lives to the world. And a related intuition to that is kind of an opportunity cost intuition, namely that creating happiness is good, but if it comes at the opportunity cost of preventing suffering, then it's frivolous and wrong to prioritize creating happiness rather than preventing suffering.
Right. But why is this so? I mean, why is it fundamentally frivolous? And why is there no value in creating happiness? It seems as though you're saying that it's not permissible to create a life of happiness if there's any suffering involved. Would that class you as a negative utilitarian, would you say? Would you self-describe in that way?
Yeah, I would identify as a negative utilitarian, but it's important to note that one can ascribe to suffering-focused ethics without being a negative utilitarian by any means. So there are many other intuitions that can animate such a view. For instance, another intuition might be, or perhaps one could rather say empirical fact that many would agree with, is that the worst suffering is far worse than the best of happiness is good. For instance, we wouldn't. It seems common, for instance, for people to say that in order to obtain 10 years of happiness, how much of the worst of suffering would you be willing to endure? And it seems that people who are willing to endure, say, a full day of pure torture, it seems like people like that are actually willing to push it quite far, and that's really quite asymmetrical. I mean, it's not like we're willing to have 10 years of the worst in order to get 10 years of happiness, but it's more, I mean, it's a lot less in terms of the duration that we're willing to go through in order to get that kind of happiness. And so that's another reason, you may say, that some people might wish to adopt suffering-focused ethics and focus on reducing suffering, simply because that's what makes most sense given this reality. And one can argue that this is not only true of potential states of suffering and happiness, but also with respect to the actual states, because as the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer argued, I mean, he tried to make the same point when he compared the feelings, quote, the feelings of an animal engaged in eating another with those of the animal being eaten. So the idea is that even in terms of just the actual states, there's just so much more suffering in the world than there is, in fact, happiness. At least one can make that case.
Sure. And what's the trade-off? Is there a trade-off? Would you say, like, if you were given the option, would you go for a day of mild suffering in order to achieve a day of extreme happiness or extreme bliss? I mean, is there a trade-off, or is it completely incommensurable, the two?
No, so if I'm given that question, I mean, it's important to say that one should keep other things equal, because in that case, I would immediately think that, well, if I have a happy day, might I then be able to be productive and then reduce a lot of suffering, maybe be able to work on that? And I think that's one of the ways in which we should be quite careful, because I think we have a lot of intuitions that say that, I mean, for instance, if we're not happy, then we do tend to suffer. I would argue. So we have to be careful with what is the alternative. I mean, would you accept this trade-off of some suffering and then some happiness compared to what? And this actually ties into another reason why one might adopt suffering-focused ethics, which is an axiology, that is a theory of value that has been defended by an author at the Foundational Research Institute named Lucas Glor, in which he argues that the value of happiness lies in its absence of suffering. And so if one takes that view, then it would actually be better not to accept that trade-off, because the alternative would be completely perfect. It has the same value as complete ecstatic happiness, just pure ecstatic happiness.
So he wouldn't be able to then distinguish between a mildly happy person and an extremely happy person. There'd be no value difference between the two, which sounds unintuitive to me.
That does indeed. One can say that should make it that sounds implausible, and that should count against tranquilism. But one can say, however, that we should be careful that mildly happy doesn't entail a little bit of suffering. And one can also turn it around and say, but if this merely mildly happy person views their own state as being completely non-problematic and indeed perfect according to them, then one can also say, then who are we to say that they're wrong about their experience? Who are we to say that they're lacking in some sense? And one can say that if we take their own perspective as, you could say, the highest arbiter of the value of this experience, then it's actually not the case that anything is missing. And so in that sense, one could say that well, maybe it's not really that counterintuitive. Maybe the only problem, a tranquilist might say, is that we have this craving for this person to experience more happiness. The problem is really in our eyes, not really in their perspective.
Well, part of the value of effective altruism is to try and be as objective as possible about states, about like how to distribute our I guess units of effort so as to do the most good. And in a sense, it's trying to take the view from nowhere. If someone were to be the best arbiter of their own well-being, that may be the case. But if you gave somebody the option to see what it was like to be a little bit more happy, and they decided, no, I'm perfect, then look, they're not being objective, because they're actually rejecting the possibility that they're not as happy or not as well off as what they could be if they had actually tried a different state of mind. But remember, I mean, what I think's being brought into the discussion right there is the person's authority to act on their own behalf, their own sort of freedom to choose, in a sense. I'm not sure if that's the same issue.
But with respect to tranquilism and the example you just gave, I think it's important to also concede the possibility that perhaps a person could then experience this quote, what we would say is a greater state of happiness, but that person might then say, well, yeah, this is truly awesome, as you said, but it's not really, but I really was also perfectly fine before, and this isn't necessarily better, although it's surely amazing also.
Right.
So I'm just saying that could be.
Well, that would be up to their preference, but yeah, for sure. Like if they don't see any value in seeing what it's like to be a bit happier, and I guess inversely, if someone is suffering, then you could say, well, they don't understand what it's like to suffer even more than what they're suffering, and so they may claim that, look, my suffering is just as important as the suffering of that other person B over there who actually objectively is suffering a lot more. And so you would then prioritize both specimens just as equally, if you're taking that into account. So to make that more clearer, so the two people, person A and person B. Person A is suffering at a level of 5. Person B is suffering at a level of 10. And so person B is suffering twice as much as person A. But person A doesn't know what it's like to actually suffer at level 10, and says that his level of suffering is paramount, and it's very, like, it's the most suffering that he can imagine, and therefore his level of suffering is just as important as person's B level of suffering to reduce. So if you were to step in and try and make an objective judgment about who's suffering to reduce first, you wouldn't be able to, if you were going by preferences alone, perhaps you wouldn't be able to make a decision. But if you were going by objective levels of suffering, you would be able to make a decision informed by the actual objective level of suffering, rather than the preferences of the agents who are suffering.
Yeah, and it's of course also worth noting that this notion of an objective level of suffering, I mean, is one that's quite controversial and disputed. Sure. It's not obvious how to define it, by which I don't mean to say that it's necessarily impossible, but it's just there are a lot of problems there. But I think it's also relevant to say that with respect to, I mean, a tranquilist wouldn't necessarily disagree with what you just said there, because it relates to suffering, whereas a tranquilist, the tranquilist axiology, what it does hold is that if one is experiencing a level of, where we could say 5 of pure happiness and then 10 of pure happiness, then according to this axiology that is tranquilism, those two states are actually of equal moral value, you could say, although perhaps they are of different value in some other sense, but it's not really strictly moral value. And that actually ties into another intuition that can animate a suffering focused view, which is this view that creating happiness of the already happy carries no moral urgency and has no moral value.
Well, look, to be honest, I do prefer, my preferences are to reduce suffering more than reducing bliss. I think once we reduce suffering and get everybody to hedonic zero, as David likes to say, then we know if we can do that, then we don't need to bother with the question of suffering. But that's going to be a long way off and maybe quite problematic. However, I think there's got to be some sort of trade-off. There. But like even EA tries to have some form of objective impartiality. It comes across as having an impassionate, dispassionate, unbiased approach to doing the most good. And so why individual preferences may sway an individual's altruistic endeavors, the philosophy of EA doesn't seem to say that reducing suffering is much more urgent than increasing pleasure. It seems to take an agnostic stance on how to do the most good. And you don't have to be utilitarian, you don't have to be a deontologist, you don't have to be a virtue ethicist or anything. You can do whatever you're doing as long as it's doing good. And so
exactly.
so it brings into question, why then should we seek to elevate suffering-focused ethics from a debate amongst EAs with preferences to a core EA principle?
Well, I'm not really arguing.
If we're trying to actually be objectively impartial.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm not saying that this should from now on be made a core value of effective altruism. Rather, as mentioned earlier, I'm just trying to invite people to have this conversation and then putting out these arguments for suffering-focused ethics, putting them out there, and so that people can really weigh them themselves and perhaps have more informed opinions about values. Because I think I mean, in my own case, I used to be much more of a classical utilitarian. I was very much inspired by Sam Harris's The Moral Landscape and completely bought that view and particularly classical utilitarianism. And I used to.
Great book.
Yeah, and I used to consider it a moral obligation to spread life into the universe. And I know Brian Tomasic, who's another self-identified negative utilitarian, he also used to have this view about spreading happiness. But I had my mind changed, I think, really mostly by arguments, but then also just watching some footage that made me reconsider my own position. And I think it's really been critically important in my own case to have these reflections about values, and I think it could well apply to many other people, that if they thought a little deeper about these issues, they might actually change their minds in some fundamental ways about how what their priorities are. Also because I think people actually often do, even if they don't quite recognize it, they actually often do speak as though they are, in a sense, they are primarily focused on suffering and do. I mean, for instance, the point I mentioned earlier about the suffering carrying particular moral urgency, I think one can also refer to certain examples that actually are quite in line with this. For instance, that we would rightly rush to send out an ambulance to help someone who's enduring extreme suffering, but not really to raise the happiness of the already happy. I mean, there doesn't seem to be a similar urgency by any means. Or similarly, if we had pills that we could distribute to those who are already happy in order to increase their happiness to maximum levels, it doesn't seem like there would be an intense urgency in distributing these pills to those people. Whereas if just a single person fell to the ground in front of us in pain, there would indeed be an urgency to help there. And I think many people actually find this, even if they aren't self-identified negative utilitarians or even ascribe to suffering-focused ethics. I think they do find that quite intuitive.
So, I mean, let's talk about this because it's interesting. I mean, it's a difficult question. I think it does require a lot of thought and research, and I like the idea that this conversation is going on amongst effective altruists. What do you think of the pinprick argument? I mean, do you think the universe would no longer be value if there was just one pinprick of pain in it, such that it would be worth just turning off because if there was the possibility of a pinprick in the future light cone of our civilization, is it worth, if we had the power to do so, to without any pain, without any suffering, just turn off civilization or turn off life in general? Would you be in favor of doing that for the sake of something, just a tiny little bit of pain in the future?
Yeah, so it's important to note that the pinprick argument is really only problematic for strict negative utilitarianism, not to suffering-focused ethics in general. So one can ascribe to suffering-focused ethics without saying that one wouldn't allow a pinprick for a paradise. But I think it is actually quite an interesting argument, the pinprick argument, and I think something that's worth, because it's so counterintuitive, it's worth noting that, as David Pearce, he often makes this point that actually, if you're a classical utilitarian, then a pinprick can be equally significant, because if we imagine that the balance of suffering and happiness is exactly zero, then adding a pinprick would then also mean that it would be better if there were no existence. So, and that also seems quite counterintuitive, that a mere pinprick should have, not necessarily as counterintuitive. I understand if people would say it's not as counterintuitive, but it still seems quite counterintuitive that a mere pinprick should make that much of a difference. Then another thing,
I'm not sure I understand that argument, because it seems as though it assumes like happiness is zero. In that context, if happiness was like a billion in David Pearce's scenario, and there were the possibility of pinprick in the future, if you were a classical utilitarian, of course you'd keep the universe around.
Yeah, and that's then exactly why a classical utilitarian would say that it's not at all counterintuitive at the same level. So I agree with that, but then one can, I mean, I do agree that at some level it's quite, that seems an implausible view. But then again, if one does adopt the tranquilist axiology, according to which that nothing at all is of the same value as just perfect bliss, then it would actually be worse to have this paradise plus a pinprick, because what you would have otherwise, the alternative, would actually also, according to tranquilism anyway, be a paradise of sorts, or at least be of equal value to a paradise, namely no suffering. It would just, according to tranquilism, be totally perfect. So that's one way in which one could actually, perhaps, I don't know, defend biting the bullet there with respect to the pinprick argument as a strict negative utilitarian. But I think it's worth not. I think one can defend a view that is negative utilitarian in a very strong sense without actually being vulnerable to this objection. And so a particular view that I have defended is this principle of sympathy for intense suffering. And it's a view that takes, you could say that it takes point of departure in classical utilitarianism, and how we usually measure happiness and suffering there, because I think we have this common sense notion that if a conscious subject deems some state of suffering worth experiencing in order to attain some given pleasure, then this pleasure is worth the suffering. But the problem is that this common sense framework breaks down at the moment where a conscious subject deems a state so bad that nothing could ever outweigh it. And so and the question is, what do we do then in this case where we have a subject who makes a value claim that is that nothing could ever outweigh this? I mean, at the same time, we can, it's made further
Right.
problematic by the fact that we can imagine a person who says that this happiness I'm experiencing is so great.
Yes, exactly. It could happen on both sides of the scale.
Exactly.
It could happen to like an extremely happy person or an extremely unhappy person.
Exactly. So these are, you could say, incompatible value claims that are being made. And what I'm arguing is that we should, in that case, we should prioritize the assessment or the evaluation of the person who is enduring the extreme suffering. So I guess you can view that as sort of an axiom of sorts that I'm arguing for, that we should, of course, an axiom that one can argue for with appeal to various intuitions, perhaps including those that we mentioned earlier about the comparative frivolousness of having a state of extreme happiness compared to avoiding this state of extreme suffering, which actually it's a little bit apropos another way to defend a suffering-focused view, namely that the absence of extreme happiness does not seem as bad as the presence of extreme suffering. So for instance, if we are imagining a person who is experiencing dreamless sleep, so there's actually no experience, rather than having the best day of their life, so enduring just having the greatest happiness possible, then it seems that the absence of that happiness isn't really a catastrophe. It isn't remotely as bad as the difference would be between this state of non-consciousness and then the very worst of suffering. It seems that that difference is much greater in moral terms, and that the difference there indeed is a difference that is a matter of a moral catastrophe. And yeah.
But yeah, I mean, like, it seems as though in that, I was going to butt in, but I didn't want to. The thought experiment you brought up before about the preferences of somebody who's extremely happy who says nothing compares to this, and the preferences of somebody who is extremely unhappy and says nothing compares to this, is the reason why we cannot compare these two states because of a difference in preference. Is it based on preferences alone? Because that's a deeper question of whether we can actually compare preferences in general, and that shouldn't just be isolated to just hedonic states, unless there's a good argument for that.
Yeah, so the question is, by what standards would we try to compare these states and measure them against each other? And I think the standard that we usually use is this common sense notion of, well, would the subject deem it worthwhile? I mean, what trade-offs would a subject accept? And then the problem is that this framework then does break down in cases where the subject says that, well, there's no trade-off you could give me. And so in that case, it's not clear what we could really appeal to, because then you could say, well, what about objective measures of say, brain states? But the problem is that ultimately the way we ascribe value to those, I mean, it's not that would necessarily be impossible, but I think the way we usually assign value to a given brain state, it would ultimately be with reference to, or it would ultimately be based in subjective report of its value. And so I think it really faces the same problem, because how would you make the translation from a brain state to a certain assessment of value if not through a subjective assessment of it?
Okay, so would you be a preference negative utilitarian then?
Well, no, I'm actually a hedonistic negative utilitarian. But so the question is also, I mean, I guess you could say, in my view, that's really the same as having an idealized preference utilitarian. I mean, so I think we can view hedonistic utilitarianism as a version of idealized preference utilitarianism. At least I think that's a defensible view.
Okay, so what do you mean by idealized preference utilitarianism?
Just in the preferences we would have if we were perfectly well informed, but the problem is that we often aren't, and so this is also one of the problems facing preference utilitarianism, namely that we often aren't perfectly informed, and so the preferences we have might actually be not what we really want if we had more information.
Yeah, part of the way of measuring the value of a particular act that effective altruists that you mentioned in your book is, the impact level, the tractability, and the neglectedness of a particular cause. This is okay. So selecting a cause area. Now, let's say that like a particular cause area to reduce suffering was pursued to such a degree that the level of tractability to make any real difference was asymptoting, but there were plenty of other cause areas which you could focus on that would, arguably had a lot more tractability to them, which could increase happiness or well-being, would you then say, well, there's the trade-off there that we can compare, and is it then worth focusing on cause areas which increase positive well-being and not just decrease negative being or suffering?
Right. I think it's an interesting question, but I would also note that I think empirically, I think the opposite happens to be the case. That it's easier actually to reduce suffering than to increase happiness to extreme heights.
Oh yeah. I think that what you're saying is true now, but this is hypothetical. So if in the case that we could, the amount of money that we can spend to reduce suffering or to help the people who are worse off in the world seems to go a lot more, a far greater distance than it is, giving an extra $1 million to a billionaire, for instance. So yeah, I mean, reducing malaria by buying bed nets and immunization, and maybe doing some form of CRISPR gene drive thing to reduce mosquito populations such that there weren't as much malaria. That seems to be like a really effective cause area. But spending the same money on like buying an extra sort of room to add on to a mansion of a billionaire seems not as effective, because it's really only going to increase the happiness or well-being of one person or family, which seems to be not as much happiness. Yeah, the trade-off is quite different.
Yeah, but so with respect to the hypothetical question you're asking, I would say that we have to be careful about what we mean by these diminishing returns, and what these, because what I would argue for is that we should reduce as much extreme suffering as we possibly can. So even if you gave me the opportunity to buy a lot of happiness very, very cheaply, I would still, and if I could then, I mean, filling up galaxies and galaxies with pure happiness, but I could, for the same amount, I could reduce the extreme suffering of just a single person for just a single day, then I would still choose to reduce this extreme suffering. And that is very much in line with the view I'm arguing for, this principle of sympathy for intense suffering, that we should give priority to those beings. And I think this is the important question that has to be dealt with respect to negative utilitarianism. And I think one of the main arguments in its favor, I would say, is rather than focusing on a pinprick versus an entire paradise, I think we should ask whether anything could outweigh extreme suffering, whether we think that's a plausible view. Would we allow extreme torture to happen for the sake of creating a paradise, or would a state of non-existence be preferable over that?
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Excellent line of inquiry. So where do you think the best progress in progressing these matters, progressing I guess research and ethics and all that, what's the best argument you've heard against what you're suggesting, by the way, while I think of it, that you've heard? But what do you think is the strongest argument in not totally against reducing suffering in general, but the particular argument of always focusing on reducing the most suffering that there is, or extreme suffering, whatever that might be?
So perhaps the strongest argument, or perhaps rather consideration, is, I think, mostly something that I find at an intuitive level, namely my own deep desire to live on, and my own personal pursuit of happiness, which I do at a personal level find a lot of value in. So I think that kind of, and also the happiness of people close to me, obviously, that means a very great deal to me. So that's, I think, the kind of thing that can make you question at least very strict negative utilitarianism. But then, by the same token, you can also then say, but one's own extreme suffering, or perhaps even worse, the extreme suffering of those very close to us. I mean, I think that's actually provides an even stronger consideration in favor of this negative utilitarian view. I mean, even stronger than if we just consider it in these impersonal terms. I think that really makes a stronger case, and much stronger than this other case in favor of the happiness of oneself and those nearest and dearest to us. Is really to prevent that, well, the thought of them going through the very worst of states, at least to me, makes a powerful case for focusing on reducing suffering, especially if one then takes this impartiality consideration into account, that, well, it really shouldn't matter whether I'm close to them or not. I mean, this extreme suffering really matters equally, no matter whom it happens to.
I guess, like, it's probably worth discussing utility. So there's an expected utility framework. So then we can sort of start like using language then to progress on to the far future, and the sorts of moral frameworks that might cache out to the to optimal futures, at least within our lifetime. So yeah, how do you describe what is the expected value framework in your words, and why is it useful?
Right. So
I mean, most people might know this, but for the benefit of those people who haven't been introduced to the concept, I think it's definitely worth bringing up.
Right. So it's basically about the importance of both factoring in the value of a given outcome, but then also the probability of the realization of this outcome. Because if a certain outcome is extremely valuable, but it's really unlikely that it's going to be brought about, then it doesn't necessarily make much sense to focus on it. And also, if something, so the basic idea is just that you need to multiply the probability of an outcome with its value, and then what you get from doing that is its expected value, the expected value of trying to bring about a certain outcome. And this is, of course, something that's employed a lot in game theory, and also so people who play poker will be familiar with this thinking in terms of expected value and betting in general.
Mm-hmm.
And it's
yeah. Go on. Oh, I was just going to ask. It's useful because you mentioned, but like, how would you describe the expected value framework if it was modified to take into account suffering-focused ethics?
Yeah, I mean, of course, suffering-focused ethics is again quite broad church, but you could say that if you're just focused on suffering, then a simple way to view
if the value was minus in the negatives, would you then have a different function to apply?
Yeah, well, you would still, then you would just try to reduce the minuses, right? I mean, try to act so as to have as little suffering in expectation as possible. That would be a strict negative utilitarian position. And as a suffering, one can, of course, then ascribe to suffering-focused ethics, and then have more in one's, or value other things as well. So that need not be exhaustive, this reducing suffering and expectation, but it would be, you could say, an important consideration what the expected suffering of our actions are. Yeah.
Okay. So what? Okay, let's talk about the expected value framework in terms of reducing population ethics, and especially about reducing the likelihood of global catastrophic risks and existential risks, or existence, I guess extinction risks. Yeah. So, I mean, yeah. Do you think it's as important to focus on reducing the likelihood of extinction risks compared to global catastrophic risks? Because if we all go extinct, then there's nobody around to suffer. So that could be a good thing for you, right?
Yeah, but there are actually many considerations here, and it's far from obvious what's really ideal. And it's also important to distinguish between the risks in some objective sense, and then also what we as agents, what kind of actions that we take to affect these risks, or that might affect these risks. Because it's important to note that I don't, for instance, know a single person who ascribes to suffering-focused ethics who thinks that we should try to increase the extinction risks, for instance. I think that's an important point, and there are various reasons why a person who wants to reduce suffering might not want to do that. I mean, one reason being that it may actually increase suffering and expectation to try to increase extinction risks. But that being said, it is of course true that from a suffering-focused perspective, especially a negative utilitarian perspective, that a future with a very large population would be worse than, or at least provided that it involves a lot of suffering, that would be worse than a much smaller population, or could be a lot worse than a much smaller population. And so that's of course a very significant difference there between, you can say, classical utilitarianism or negative utilitarianism. I mean, do we focus on net happiness minus suffering, or do we focus on the total amount of suffering? And I made a small graph here just to try to show this. If it matters a lot whether we think it's the absolute amount of suffering that matters, or whether it's happiness minus suffering. Because in this end here we have, I mean, so it's population here and time here, and the green is happiness and the red is suffering. And with the smaller population, we can see the happiness minus suffering is a lot lower than here. But we also have that the absolute amount of suffering is a lot smaller than what we have here. And the question is, what is it that we think really matters? And my book, in my book, I try to invite people to really consider this very carefully. Well, what is it that we think matters? Is it the happiness minus the suffering, or is it the absolute amount of suffering that is the most important thing to think about? And of course, I argue for the latter. And
do you want to hold that directly up to the screen, sure, just in case people couldn't see it, because it's a bit. Okay, you talk, because I think Google thinks that I'm talking. So you talk while holding it up.
Okay, cool.
And that way people will be able to see it in Google, and know to switch to your camera instead of mine.
And it's then important to note that, well, a negative utilitarian can say that, well, the larger population would be much worse, and yet still not try to work on increasing extinction risk, or focusing on reducing the probability of that this large population would come about, as could, for instance, happen if we colonized space. And what many negative utilitarians have argued for is that we instead focus on the red numbers, so to speak, and focus on trying to reducing that as much as we can, so that we should actually instead try to work here, as that's what many negative utilitarians think. That's where we can make the biggest difference, by trying to work here on the margin, rather than trying to delete the entire population. Also because there is a risk that if the human there is a risk that human extinction could actually lead to more suffering than the alternative, because
in the process of the extinction event, there could be quite a lot of suffering involved.
Yeah, so there are many considerations here. For instance, there is that if humans go extinct, then it could be that another civilization may emerge later on Earth, and it could be that it would be worse than what humans would, the outcome that humans would create. And another consideration is that, and it may sound a little bit more far-fetched, but I think it should be taken seriously nonetheless, namely that if other civilizations emerge elsewhere and they propagate and
not on Earth,
would the space colonization that this civilization creates, would it actually be worse?
I agree. It in a sense, like there's the whole universe is a niche for life to evolve, in a sense, and there's plenty of scope for suffering in the process of evolution. And so the quicker that an advanced civilization gets to the point where it can have the power to go out there and reduce the likelihood of suffering within its sort of Hubble volume or light cone, the less likely there will be. The more good that can be done, like especially from a suffering-focused ethics point of view. So, if extinction does happen, then it'll at least delay the time at which a civilization is capable of doing such a thing. And yeah,
although the delay in a cosmic timescale, the delay may actually be rather insignificant. I mean, if we're merely talking about millions of years here on Earth, a space colonization wave being delayed, that's really not very significant. It's much more significant the kind of quality that this colonization wave would have in terms of the experience of sentient beings in it.
Yeah. So that's why I said at least, yeah. But yes. So we're going to move on to long-term futures and S risks, and the need to avoid civilizations with a lot of suffering involved, or any suffering, as you'd argue. So do you want to go over what an S risk is again?
Yes, indeed. So in light of the discussion that we just had, we can see that there's a lot of uncertainty about the future, including when it comes to this question about extinction risks. But one particular risk that the Foundational Research Institute has written a lot about and focused on is this so-called an S risk, or a risk of astronomical future suffering, where we I mean, what it could look like in more specific terms is, of course, difficult to say, but an analogy that's often used is that of factory farming. No one really wanted to make a lot of non-human animals suffer a lot, but nonetheless, this happened because of various economic forces. We just like these cheap, quote, animal products, and hence we have created this living hell for a vast number of beings. And the fear is that this might happen in the future. I mean, that we could perhaps colonize space and in that way create a lot of suffering for sentient beings. So in that sense, I mean, one can view factory farming as kind of an example of just how bad things could go, and also of how it might not be that far-fetched. I mean, so all we would need to do would be to spread our current condition. I mean, to spread humanity, say, to other planets and bring factory farms with us. That would already be an S risk of sorts. But other scenarios, more specific scenarios, include just harvesting energy from other stars and then using this energy to run simulations in which suffering may occur. I mean, different people
mind crimes, or ancestor simulations that include a lot of mind crimes. Yeah, that's
for instance, various simulations. The worry is basically just that we could transform a lot of the matter and energy that's available to us out there in outer space into suffering. And because this, and one can say that this sounds very unlikely, although that's a point that could be disputed. But even if it is quite unlikely, the enormous disvalue of these scenarios imply that the expected disvalue that would be of these scenarios could be quite high, and therefore that it might make sense to focus on them. Also because it's quite neglected. I don't think there's really apart from the Foundational Research Institute, these S risks aren't actually, not many people in the effective altruism community focus on this. So yeah.
Okay, right. Just as an aside, what do you think about animal testing? Do you think there's any moral value in testing on animals to produce medicines that in the future may reduce suffering in people?
So that's quite a controversial question. I mean, so in my book about speciesism,
Yes,
I've argued against animal testing. I mean, with the analogy to, I mean, would we accept testing on, say, certain ethnic minorities. And I think most people would be quite reluctant to say that we should do that. I mean, so I'm actually happy to take the discussion about whether it would be okay to test on ethnic minorities, human ethnic minorities. But I would just say that I don't think there's a fundamental difference there between non-human animals and then ethnic human minorities, human ethnic minorities.
And the speciesism argument comes into play there, where we're all just animals, and in a sense, we can't really say that we have some sort of ontological privilege just by being human. It's just a matter of scale of complexity in the minds of some animals compared to others.
Exactly.
And it could be the case that we just don't know this, and it could be the case that some animals have much of a higher sensitivity to suffering than humans do. And so putting them under, certain conditions, like, for instance, what if we found out that pigs have less of a tolerance for pain, have just when they do feel pain, it's just much more of an intense, raw experience than when we feel pain.
Yeah, exactly, and various plausible arguments have actually been given for that very position. I mean, for instance, Richard Dawkins has made an evolutionary argument for that conclusion, where he argues that he thinks it seems plausible that a, quote, less intelligent being might need more pain in order to be motivated to alter their actions. But of course, it's an open question, but we should at least, we should at least concede the possibility that they might actually be experiencing pain far more intensely than humans. And one can also say, well, even if they didn't, then what would the implications be, right? Because we don't accept that we can discriminate. If we found that some humans felt pain less intensely, I mean, we wouldn't think that should have very significant ethical implications, and then suddenly it's okay to discriminate against these beings. So, but to answer your question, then, I mean, if we do translate it into this context of ethnic minorities, would I then accept that we do experiments on them for the greater good? I think one has to be very careful here with too naive consequentialist thinking. I mean, for instance, for one, you could say, well, why should it only be a certain group, a particular group of beings that we should do experiments on? And another thing is, what might be the secondary consequences? I mean, you could say, so we do these experiments and we get these useful results, but what are the consequences for, say, our view of these beings? What, as a result of that, we do these experiments? How does that impact how we both view and, more importantly, even treat them? So yeah, I think that is those are some crucial considerations. But of course, if you do make kind of an abstract thought experiment, we do this and then we have this great outcome where we prevent a lot of torturous suffering, then yeah, in the abstract, I would say that would be a good idea to do it.
Yeah,
then.
So I guess you'd be in favor of if people willingly offered themselves up for test as being test subjects to help further research in development of certain medicines that might reduce the impacts of certain diseases, ultimately reducing suffering and increasing bliss. Would you see that as permissible? I mean, it sounds as though you would.
Sure.
So if people had the preference to, to offer themselves up, for instance, like, let's just say this is quite a valid sort of point for people who already have a disease, who are willing to offer themselves to be test subjects, so as to increase the likelihood that their future selves may be the recipient of a drug that comes, that comes along as a result of them sort of going through these experimental trials.
Yeah, and then whether, sorry, I think you fell out there.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay. So, like, for instance, there's a lot of treatments that are experimental and haven't yet been approved by the Food and Drug Administration or other authorities, that may work, but it could be up to the individual to put themselves to offers themselves up to be, test subjects or patient zeros or patients who are like where there's a risk of it not working and in fact increasing a lot more suffering than they had if they didn't go through the testing procedure themselves. Or the alternative is that they just wait for somebody else to do it, and maybe there'll be a cure to whatever disease they might have come down the line. But there's no guarantees. Do you know where I'm coming from?
I'm not entirely sure, but I feel like saying that's obviously the importance of being well informed there. I mean, again, related to idealized preferences versus actual ones, right? I mean, so and also just, of course, that's a crucial thing in effective altruism in general, namely our empirical uncertainty. Is action A or action B going to reduce? Which one of them is going to reduce the most suffering or create the most happiness? And I think that is it's very difficult to say, really, and it's not obvious how to handle our great uncertainty. I guess all we can really do is make our best assessment of the expected value, plus factoring in other considerations that might be relevant, and then try to make the best decision, all things considered. The scenario that you described, I'm not sure. It doesn't sound like there were any easy answers there.
Well, I mean, case in point, a transhumanist or life extensionist, Liz Parrish. You've probably heard of her. She went through a number of gene therapy sessions, and she's tried to increase the length of her telomeres so as to reduce the likelihood of early onset of certain diseases related to old age, and ultimately, maybe as a side effect, increase her lifespan. And also other therapies which increase muscle mass and all these. Some of these things that she's done is in highly experimental and controversial. So she had to go out of America and get these therapies overseas.
Right.
And other people can do the same, and she's trying to make it easier for people to go and experiment, do experiments on themselves, or sorry, I shouldn't really phrase it like that. Have gene therapy done to themselves so as to increase the likelihood of them having a life, like a longer life and a longer, healthier life, and having there's a reward there, but there's also the possibility that it's not going to work and it'll cause a lot of suffering.
Well, I would actually follow John Stuart Mill there and emphasize the importance of personal freedom and personal autonomy, also because there really are also a lot of bad consequences of not having this. And I think we should be free, within reason, of course, to do what we want with ourselves, and to make our own decisions on our own behalf. So I'm very supportive of that, but within reason, of course. So, and I think
But what is the reason? I mean, how much level of informability, do you think is permissible? I mean, we wouldn't give the child, like a child who's not yet well informed, the burden of having to make this sort of decision. If there was a child and the parents did the research if the only option were for them to have experimental treatment, and the parents were in a position to make the decision about whether the child should go through this experimental treatment or not, would that be permissible?
Yeah,
I think it's
very difficult to give an answer to that, because I think it depends a lot on the particulars, also on the kinds of consequences that could follow, and also how well informed this person was. And so I wouldn't give a strong opinion on that kind of case.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So where are we up to? Oh God, I've lost my questions. So is there any other topics like David Bannatar? What do you think of the idea of antinatalism? David Bannatar is quite well known within some of the futurist community focus on suffering ethics, so suffering focused ethics, and you wrote a book, Better Never to Have Been.
Yeah.
Have you read that book?
Well, I haven't read all of it, but I've read most of it. Yeah, and so I actually don't find his argument very appealing, and that's because I'm a consequentialist focused on reducing as much extreme suffering as possible, and I don't really think that's Benatar's main aim, and I think it's actually not obvious what's best when it comes to. I mean, it doesn't seem to me as though antinatalism is a very effective thing to focus on if we're trying to reduce as much suffering as we possibly can. Not least because most antinatalists only seem to focus on human procreation, which is not really the source of I mean, the vast majority of beings who are suffering on the planet are not humans. And I mean, I've actually myself written a case for, I've written an essay called The Speciesism of Leaving Nature Alone and the Theoretical Case for Wildlife Antinatalism. So I've actually defended an antinatalist conclusion, at least in theory. But I don't think that Benatar's argument, I mean, both his argument, I don't find it as strong, I mean, even close to being as strong as the case for sympathy for intense suffering. His argument is this the asymmetry argument, that the absence of suffering is good, whereas the absence of happiness is not bad, and so he gets this value matrix with the asymmetry being that non-existence is good, whereas existence entails both suffering and happiness, which is bad and good respectively. So it's not a pure good, and hence it's not. It's less good than non-existence according to Benatar. But I don't think that argument is that. I mean, certainly it seems to fail to convince most classical utilitarians and also myself in particular, especially when I was a classical utilitarian. I didn't really find that a very good argument, and also just in terms of what we should be focusing on, what's best in practice to be focusing on. I don't really think that antinatalism is what we should be focusing on. Although, of course, I do have a lot of sympathy to the antinatalist position, also when it comes to human procreation.
Well, do you think there's a lot of talk about X risk, which we were just talking about before, and we had some examples. Well, I was going to bring up David Benatar's work in reference to X risk, but somehow we veered off into whether we should have animal testing and whether humans should be able to subject themselves to experimental testing. But yeah, back on the X risk bandwagon, it seems as though people actually argue that likelihood of existential risk is quite small, but I don't actually really agree that it's possibly really small. I think it's quite likely that we could go extinct. But do you think it sounds like we're just catastrophizing over religious-sounding apocalyptic scenarios too much? I mean, do you think to the community outside the futurist community and the EA community, and maybe even within these communities, it just sounds like we're crazy to talk about such things?
Well, we may sound crazy, but that's not the same as saying that it isn't indeed plausible, and that the probability isn't indeed quite high as you say it might be. I think it's difficult to say. I mean, you have various arguments that do seem to at least weakly suggest that it could be quite likely. For instance, the doomsday argument, and you also have the Fermi paradox with the great filter. Where is it? Is it ahead of us? I don't think it's that obvious to say. I think we should have a quite wide probability distribution, so to speak, of what the probability is, what the actual risk is. How likely is it that extinction is imminent? So I don't know. Okay. Basically, yeah.
In terms of approaches to reducing suffering, a lot of people argue that social configurations and power relations have a lot to do with it, and they're really the ones to blame for suffering and how it is today, and perpetuating inequality. Well, I mean, some criticize EAs as really turning a blind eye to this systematic and structural factors, as root causes for a lot of the suffering that exists in the world today, and the imbalances of well-being amongst the nations of the world and people within those nations. So what's your take on this?
Well, I think it's probably true that we could reduce a lot of suffering via systemic change, but I also don't happen to agree at all with the position that it's mainly due to our institutions say that there is so much suffering on the planet, because it's important to emphasize that the vast majority of suffering happening on the planet is endured by non-human animals, especially non-human animals in nature, and it's not really human institutions that have created this suffering by any means. But of course, that's not to say that that we couldn't reduce a lot of suffering by focusing on these institutions, nor is it even to say that we couldn't, that it shouldn't perhaps be even our main focus to create systemic change. I think that's quite plausible, also because it's likely going to have, it is likely going to be much more significant with respect to the far future. I mean, most beings suffering in the far future will be impacted by humans, even much. I mean, provided that we don't go extinct, then it will indeed be decided by our for instance, how our institutions are constructed, and but also just our values more generally. And I think it's not really clear if we are, for instance, trying to affect value change. Should we then focus on institutions, or what should we focus on? Should we focus on trying to more at the grassroots level to have this conversation about values? Or it's far from obvious to me, but that most of the suffering today is due to poor institutions. I think that's just empirically completely wrong.
Mm. Okay, so well, in terms of like looking over some underappreciated issues in effective altruism, you've already spoke about clarity about fundamental values and deeper thinking about extreme suffering. So let's have a look at some crucial considerations in general. It'd be interesting. I was thinking when I was considering one of your points you made earlier is if we could put in a big matrix the different sort of moral frameworks and how they cache out in terms of cause prioritization. Like if we had sort of a strong negative utilitarian view, a weak negative utilitarian view, just a classic utilitarian view, and all these different sort of approaches to moral frameworks, and how they'd sort of change the balance between or the ranking of course prioritization. Yeah, I think that would be interesting. I don't know if there's any efforts in this particular area. Yeah, it could be something great for the Foundational Research Institute to sort of wrap up. Do you know of anything like that? Or?
Well, I mean, of course, there's this newly founded Global Priorities Institute, and I think they might be aiming to do something like that. That's at the University of Oxford. But I think it's really, really difficult to do that. I mean, to do course prioritization, it seems, how would you become an expert on that? Because it just depends on so many factors, and it's so multidisciplinary. So
it does sound quite difficult.
It is very difficult, and crucial considerations can really, I mean, for instance, just a change of values can suddenly change everything, right? From if your main focus was to increase happiness, then you would focus on, I think, very different things than if your main focus is to reduce suffering. And so I think that's one reason why I think these considerations about fundamental values are so important, because everything else seems derivative from the answers we give to these fundamental questions. But yeah, I mean, other questions of fundamental importance that also seem quite neglected are just the structure of reality. Basically, I mean, what kind of universe do we live in, and what are likely futures? And we already mentioned this, the problem of could other civilizations emerge, and what are the so what is the probability of that, and what are the likely outcomes of such civilizations? Those considerations, at least if we take a long-term future perspective, those are really important, I think. And also, and much more speculatively, much more exotically, you could say that the risk of creating parallel universes is also something that we should perhaps do more research on. So Brian Tomasic has written an essay about this, creating lab universes, and I've also written a bit about it myself, because it seems quite significant if we potentially could create an entire new universe, which itself could give rise to many more universes. I think that is something that it appears quite neglected, in spite of the fact that actually quite a number of physicists have been talking about it as being perhaps a possibility, which is, so I think that's something that effective altruists might want to look deeper into.
Interesting. Yeah, it sounds quite science fiction-y, but like, is this something that you think will be accessible to us in the near future, or can we do it now? Like, do you believe?
No, I
like,
think
it's Large Hadron Collider like secretly creating parallel universes.
No, I think it's extremely unlikely. But the thing is just that, again, referring back to the expected value framework, that the value of or this value of such an outcome could potentially be just enormous. So I think it's worth thinking about it, even though it does appear extremely unlikely, and also because our thinking about these things might also refine our thinking about other unexpected ways in which we could affect or impact a lot of happiness or suffering. So I think these kinds of crucial considerations are really just basic questions about, well, what is the structure of our reality, and what are the possibilities that lie before us. I think that's really worth doing some work on, which perhaps you could argue that implies physics and perhaps even philosophy of physics, studying that. That's something I think it's potentially interesting and potentially of great importance.
Sure. I guess it's important to to take into account sort of epistemic or philosophical fallibilism, in the sense that we don't know that our particular philosophical framework is correct. But if we were to put all these things into a matrix without trying to look like it's a big Pascal's wager argument, we may find that there's convergences in valuable causes that generally relate to the I guess the positive playing out of different philosophical positions, and working out which cause areas would either be the worst to work on according to some philosophical positions in ethics or ethical positions, and some of the best, and which areas amongst all these possible philosophical positions are the hotspots, the ones which can create the most value across the board. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
useful.
Of course. There's also the problem then that some value systems point in totally opposite directions when it comes to what we should be doing. For instance, with respect to should we create more universes or not? I mean, again, this graph becomes kind of relevant because, I mean, according to, if we think it's net happiness minus suffering, then we should arguably do it, provided that the future is indeed as bright as many effective altruists hope. But if we're concerned about the total amount of suffering, then we shouldn't. So I think.
Well, I can think of one area which could count as being pretty important for every ethical framework, is increasing our understanding of the universe and how it operates, and I guess further research into ethics and epistemology. I can't see any good reason not to increase our understanding of the way things work.
Yeah, I think exactly advancing our conversation about what matters and being more reflective about also just about how things might go really wrong. Because I mean, even if we can't agree on ideal outcomes, we can still, I mean, for instance, classical utilitarians as well as negative utilitarians, but also just pretty much anybody can agree at what a very bad outcome would look like. And I think we can, and that's also one of the reasons why S risks could actually be something that we should all be able to focus on, because we can all agree that it would be very bad if we created just an enormous amount of extreme suffering, other things being equal.
Sure.
And so I think, yeah, that's also something that I know Brian Tomasic argues for the same thing, that being more reflective and being more reflective, I guess you could say, is quite a robust thing with respect to also many different value systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like some of David Deutsch's writings on the topic of extending our understanding. The sort of the value and the reach of understanding will have a big impact into what sort of things are achievable, or what sort of solutions are available to solve these sorts of problems. Some of the problems may be too complex for us to solve with our current understanding of how the universe works, or our current level of knowledge. May require more intelligence, may require more knowledge or more understanding. And so, yeah, the greater we make progress in these areas, there could be quite a lot of dividends for doing so, should I say. In terms of go on.
No, I just wanted to note that perhaps it's also important not to beg the question too much and assume too much about what progress would look like in these regards, because we often tend to, especially in the effective altruism movement, to take a very, you could perhaps say, rationalist approach, that our deeper insights would necessarily have to come from maybe some very clever mathematical argument or something like that. But I think there's also, it's important not to take a too narrow approach either. I mean, I think we should really seek quite broadly when it comes to this, and to advancing ourselves and being more well considered, and seek as broad sources of information as we possibly can within. I mean, there's probably a bit of a, I mean, for instance, to not neglect the social science, but also to not neglect non-Western traditions of philosophy and thought. I think that's actually, quite important. Also with respect to suffering-focused ethics, for example, that's, I think, a lot of, for instance, you take something like Jainism or Buddhism, they both emphasize the importance of suffering and worthwhile considerations in favor of such views, I think, can be found in those traditions as well. And the methods as well, yeah.
Well, I mean, we've spoken about a lot of concepts here, and it's certainly been awesome and very interesting. But in terms of what can people take away, what are some, from this interview, what are some concrete steps that people can take in order to reduce suffering?
So, yeah, concrete steps. I think just in the first place, considering these various arguments in favor of suffering-focused ethics and whether one indeed finds them convincing or not. I think that's it's worth spending some time on those, and indeed reflecting more on deeper values. In particular, I would put forth the question: do we think that there is anything more important than preventing extreme suffering? Is there anything we can put on the value scale that could plausibly counterbalance, say, states of extreme torture? And I think that's an important question to consider, not least because it has quite significant implications for our actions. So maybe I'll just keep it short and leave it at that. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, it's been wonderful having you on Science, Technology in the Future, Magnus. I've had like a few interviews with David Pearce as well, and Brian Tomasic. But yeah, it's been great to talk to you about these subjects as well, and it's great that you're also doing a lot of writing on the subject. And I'm really hoping that we can make continue or help the conversation keep going and help us learn more about these areas. So yeah, if anybody wants to find out more about what you do and some of the books you've written, is there any sort of central location that people can go to in order to find out more?
Well, yeah, I have a website that's just magnusvinding.com, so just my name.com.
Okay, fantastic. Well, it's been wonderful, Magnus. And thanks to all everybody listening and tuning into the show today. It's been really, really good. All right, well, I'll leave it there and see you next time.